Lee Know and Seungmin have been in the same group for 8 years. At one point, Lee Know said that if they'd gone to the same school, he probably would have transferred just to get away from him. Seungmin was sitting right next to him when he said that. They live in separate dorms now. They bicker every time they're in the same room. But in 2025, Seungmin spent months writing a song. When he finished it, he played it for Sriracha. Their first question? Did you write this thinking about Lee Know? Before filming an interview, Stray Kids filled out a questionnaire. One of the questions asked them, if you weren't in this group, which member would you have ignored? And Seungmin saw who Lee Know wrote down. It was him. Lee Know denied it, deflecting that maybe Seungmin had put down a few names too. So if Lee Know was practically trying to stay away from Seungmin as much as possible, how did he end up needing him in his life so much? If you enjoy thoughtful, positive content about Stray Kids just like this, consider subscribing. In 2024, Lee Know and Seungmin were both part of a Stray Kids Skiz Code episode that ended with the winning team eating grilled eel. The losing team got rice and John. And even on the winning side, the last piece came down to rock, paper, scissors. Lee Know lost his round and didn't get any. Seungmin asked who lost, to which the members told him the way only people who've known each other for years would. Your favorite person. He didn't even react to that. He certainly didn't deny it, let alone play along with it. He just got up, walked over to where Lee Know was sitting, and gave him part of his own meal. A few months later, in June 2024, they were filming another episode. This time, it was Limbo. Everyone trying to slide under a bar on a bed without knocking it off. Lee Know was almost through when Seungmin walked by and tapped it down. The ceiling camera caught the whole thing. Lee Know immediately jumped up and grabbed the bar like he was going to use it. To anyone watching either of those moments for the first time, it looks exactly like what it looks like. Two people who genuinely might not like each other. One sharing food subtly, the other grabbing a bar. None of it makes sense unless you actually know who these two are. Lee Know once said that if he and Seungmin had gone to the same high school, he probably would have transferred. He didn't secretively say it. Seungmin was sitting right next to him when he said it. He didn't deny it was directed at him. He didn't even look surprised. That's the version of this relationship most people see. Two people who have spent 8 years in the same group and still can't quite pretend to be easy with each other. Seungmin knocking the bar down wasn't a mistake. He walked over and tapped it specifically, and Lee Know grabbing it back was simply an instinctive response he'd built while around Seungmin. What makes it especially interesting is that neither of them seems bothered by any of it. Seungmin doesn't apologize for the limbo bar. He also doesn't hold a grudge about the questionnaire. They just keep showing up in the same room and doing it again. The friction isn't something either of them is trying to fix. It's just part of how they function. Lee Know had been in the industry since he was a teenager, working his way up through dance studios and backup gigs before JYP ever called him back. When he finally got the call, he had 2 weeks. 2 weeks to learn everything, meet everyone, and prove he belonged in a group that had already been training together for months. He came in last and had to move the fastest. Seungmin has been in the group since he was 17. He came in through an open audition, placed second, and spent the years that followed turning himself into someone nobody could overlook. Not because it came naturally. He said himself he has no memories of singing in front of people as a kid, or standout moments in school talent shows. Just still a love for music and a willingness to keep showing up until that was enough. Lee Know has described Seungmin as someone who just doesn't express his emotions much.
뭐가 필요하다 하면은 신경 써서 해주긴 하겠지만 그렇게 얘기 안 하면은 진짜 모르는 애니까.
Lee Know has talked about what it's actually like to spend time with Seungmin, beyond the bickering, when it's just the two of them in a room. He says it's a warm, comfortable space for him. With Seungmin, there aren't any deep, serious life talks where someone has to say the right thing. It's more like being with someone you've known so long that you don't have to be anything in particular. You just throw out stupid jokes or laugh over basically nothing. The kind of easy that's hard to find when you're living in the life they live. And then there's the silence. Lee Know said that if you're not actually close with someone, silence feels suffocating, like something that needs to be filled before it gets awkward. With Seungmin, it's just comfortable. They can sit in the same room and say nothing, and it doesn't feel unusual for either of them. In 2025, Seungmin spent months writing a song around one specific thing, Lee Know's voice. He performed it with Lee Know on the last night of the North American leg, in front of a sold-out stadium, and standing there, he said it felt like the highlight of his life's movie. But there are things Seungmin knows about Lee Know that don't show up in any of that. A slight tremble in his pupils, barely visible if you're not paying attention. He knows when Lee Know is going through something difficult, not because Lee Know tells him, but because he's learned to read it. Before a show, he'll quietly slide something over. Pudding. Sometimes he'll ask what's going on, but usually he doesn't even need to. You don't learn those things about someone by accident, and you certainly don't learn them about someone you can barely stand. So where did it actually start? In July 2017, the last Stray Kids member to walk through JYP's doors was Lee Know. Seungmin was already there when he arrived, and somewhere in those 2 weeks, before they started recording and before any of it became a show, he became the first person Lee Know felt comfortable around. But then Lee Know was eliminated. Lee Know made a mistake during his rap performance. It was just a single error, but it was enough to prove he hadn't trained enough. He started to cry, saying he should have just done it like the rehearsal. He tried to stay professional, but he couldn't. Lee Know resented himself. He said that if he'd slept 1 hour less, practiced 1 hour more, maybe it would have been different.
잊고 싶다는 그 간절함이 부족했나 봐요.
믿기는 싫지만 정말 마지막일 수도 있어서 고마웠어요. 저 끝낼게요.
Seungmin couldn't finish his interview. The camera was rolling, and he was trying to talk about what had happened, but he just couldn't get through it. They'd known each other for maybe 2 months. Later, Lee Know wrote him a letter, not to the group, to Seungmin. He told him he felt bad that he cried so hard, and then he told him he was grateful, that he was keeping that moment forever. Both of them arrived at JYPE and were told they weren't quite what they thought they were. Lee Know had spent years becoming one of the best dancers in the country. JYP looked at him and heard a voice too weak to sing, so he rapped instead. His first lines on a Stray Kids track weren't vocals. They were a rap verse in District 9. Seungmin came in as a vocalist. He just wasn't the main vocalist yet. He says he was 5% talent and 95% effort. He couldn't skip a single day of practice without feeling it affect him. For years, Lee Know would quietly correct Seungmin's form during choreography practice. He never made a moment of it. He was just noticing something off and helping him improve. Seungmin talked about it as well. The way Lee Know would come over and casually point out something he was doing differently without realizing it. But there hadn't been a moment yet where either of them could see what the other had actually become, where the years of work became visible all at once. Kingdom Legendary War in 2021 was that moment for Seungmin. He'd recommended IU's Love Poem as his performance choice, and even hid in a closet backstage from nerves before going on. When he performed with May V, they received all 33 votes. Lee Know was backstage watching him, and when Seungmin began singing, he gasped. He'd been with Seungmin for years, practiced alongside him for years, and yet he never failed to surprise him. By 2023, after years of focusing almost entirely on dance and rap, Lee Know was beginning to step into Seungmin's field more. He'd always wanted to be a vocalist, and especially now more than ever before, he was getting a chance to do just that. Vocal Racha had been taking lessons separate from JYP Entertainment for some time at this point, but now Lee Know was going with them. He was actively improving his vocals with Seungmin. Seungmin had been listening to Lee Know's voice for years, but he was also deliberately paying attention to it. He was learning everything about his voice. In 2025, his attention became the core of a song, and when 3 Racha heard it, they already knew whose voice it was written for. Lee Know spent years learning dance, then taught Seungmin how to move. Seungmin spent years learning the sound of his voice. From November 2020 to December 2021, Lee Know and Seungmin had every Monday together. It wasn't really their idea. They'd been booked as weekly guests on Day6's radio show, a storytelling battle where listeners voted on who performed better. They showed up, they competed, they went home. Lee Know won more rounds than Seungmin, But Monday nights became something else. Before the show, they'd go to a cafe, then take a walk with their coffee. Then they'd get dinner at a Sunday gukbak place they kept going back to, not necessarily because it was the world's best food, but because it was theirs. Something familiar, something with good memories attached to it, a comfortable routine for the two people whose lives were anything but easy. They kept up the same sequence, most Mondays for over a year. Unlike the radio show, this was something they could do with their free time consistently. It's just what happens when two people are handed the same night every week, and neither of them wastes it. Most people don't realize how meaningful a routine is until it's already over. Lee Know and Seungmin probably didn't either. It was just Monday. Then it was just Monday again. Years later, while looking back, Lee Know called it their highlight. He didn't refer to some performance of theirs or one of their huge milestones since debut. Just a cafe and a walk and a soup place they kept going back to.
보기 싫어도 볼 수밖에 없었던 그때.
He was joking, kind of. At some point, Seungmin started making coffee every morning and cleaning the machine. Lee Know noticed. Eventually, he learned how to use it too. And on the mornings Seungmin didn't have time after washing up, Lee Know would make it for him instead. Neither of them made a big deal out of it. It just became how they lived. However, living together is different from choosing each other. For years, Lee Know and Seungmin shared the same walls. First the full team, then smaller groups with rooms right next to each other. Lee Know has said they get along better now that they don't live together. He's not trying to bash Seungmin, it's just the honest truth between them. But not everything from those years was rough. One day, their schedule cleared unexpectedly, and Seungmin pushed for them to go somewhere. Nothing planned beforehand, purely a spur-of-the-moment impulsive decision. They bought ingredients, grilled meat, and stayed up laughing until dawn. Lee Know still has the video of himself tapping a punching bag in the dark while everyone else had fallen asleep. It felt like we came back with memories that would last, he said. That's what they are when the pressure lets up. Just two people who stayed up until dawn because neither of them wanted the night to end. After Seungmin appeared on Lee Moo-jun's Service, a respected Korean music show known for vocalists, Lee Know came to his room late at night while he was removing his makeup. I saw the show. You did well. Then he went to his room. He was really shy about it. Lee Know has never been someone who tries to artificially care for people. He says he just wants to take care of people without making it feel like a burden. So when he shows up, it's more subtle, something like a short message to him at midnight. When Lee Know is going through something difficult, and there's usually a period of it each year, Seungmin doesn't pry his way in. He said that as a younger member, walking over and asking felt too heavy, too formal. Lee Know probably wouldn't want that anyway. So instead, he just makes himself available, creates a small opening if Lee Know is ready. And when Lee Know does something that moves him, Seungmin notices. In their 2022 Two Kids room, he described watching him dance from the back of the practice room. Seungmin says he couldn't pull off what he was seeing even if he practiced for a year. He wasn't just complimenting him for the sake of the video. He was just telling the truth about someone he'd been watching for a long time. They both work that way. Small gestures that carry big meanings to them. In their 2026 Two Kids room, Seungmin told Lee Know that when he leads the team from the center, there's a vibe only he can pull off, like watching a captain. And when he sings, not the polished version, but the softer one, the one that sounds like it comes from somewhere genuine, Seungmin said he just really likes it. Lee Know didn't address the compliment directly. He just said that things had been really good lately, that everything felt smooth, and that what he wanted most was for it to stay exactly like this. 8 years of Monday nights and midnight compliments and small gestures that neither of them have ever named. And then in 2025, Seungmin put all of it into a song. Seungmin had described the process of writing cinema as thinking about one specific thing, not necessarily a feeling or a concept, but a singular sound. A sound Lee Know makes, natural, unguarded, what he called that old, kind of tickly sound that just comes out of him. The kind of thing you only notice after years of being in the same room as someone. Seungmin spent months on it. Along the way, he asked 3racha for direction. Nothing specific, just which way to pull the song. He didn't tell them what he was working toward. Then he finished everything and played them the recording. They knew immediately. Didn't you write this thinking about Lee Know? He had. He just hadn't said so. When they performed it live for the first time, it was the Latin American leg of the Dominate tour. Stadiums, sold out nights. By the time they reached Toronto, the last North American show, Seungmin stood in front of a full stadium before they performed it and said that lately, moments like this felt like they could be the highlight of his life's movie. The song wasn't written before the tour. It came out of the tour, out of what it felt like to stand on those stages night after night with Lee Know beside him. Then there was a show, likely Citi Field in New York, June 2025. The stage was soaked from rain. Seungmin decided at the last second not to run out for their entrance, but he didn't tell Lee Know. Lee Know sprinted out alone, looked back, and felt awkward. Seungmin only told him after the concert ended.
미리 말했어야 되는데 약간 그랬지.
The thing is, Lee Know had been doing this the whole time, writing Seungmin's name on a questionnaire, saying he'd transfer schools, grabbing a limbo bar. Every single time, it looked like they were far apart, but every single time, it was quite the opposite. It was just his way of saying, I see you, I know you well enough to tease you, and I'm not going anywhere. That's the answer to the question. He never needed to stay away from Seungmin. He just needed everyone else to think he did. In 2026, someone asked them how well they actually know each other. Seungmin said about 20%. Lee Know said about 10%. After 8 years, after spending every Monday for over a year together, after one of them built a whole song around the sound of the other's voice, even after writing a letter that said he was keeping a moment forever, Lee Know's answer is still 10%. Lee Know has never been someone who overstates things. If he says 10%, he means 10%. And maybe that's exactly why Seungmin has spent 8 years paying such close attention. Because with Lee Know, what you can see is never all of it. They're not a perfect friendship. They've said so themselves. They have different personalities, things they aren't compatible on, and they're better off now that they don't share the same walls. But none of that stopped Seungmin from getting up when Lee Know didn't have food. None of it stopped Lee Know from showing up at midnight to say a few words and then leaving. Lee Know ended the letter he wrote to Seungmin with this: I think we have opposite personalities, but that's why it's more fun, and I keep teasing you. He wrote that years ago, but somehow it's still true. If you want to see how Hyunjin and Han used to despise each other as trainees, but grew to be some of the closest members in Stray Kids, you can click the video on screen. Thanks for watching. Bye 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 bye.